From the icy lands of the north to Africa, from Istanbul to America. Brave men, their axes stained with blood, bodies adorned with tattoos, setting forth toward Odin's Valhalla. Blood and soil, drink and women, adventure and wealth. A wild people who have carved their names into centuries. Heads may roll, legs may break, but never broken spirits. Unforgettable revenge will be taken. Because they are Vikings. But make no mistake, this story is not just theirs. It's your story, our story. Are you ready to go back 1200 years? Then gather your courage, because this journey is not for the faint-hearted. Let's begin. The date is April 30th, 793, in a typical Viking village in Scandinavia. Everyday life continues as usual. Locals, striving to make a living, engage in intense work amidst the shared culture of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Though they compete with each other, they maintain their existence as distinct peoples and small tribes within the Viking society. In the same year, they raided Lindisfarne Monastery in England, leaving a mark on world history with their plunder and massacre. While significant attacks had occurred in previous years, raiding a monastery considered sacred had a shocking effect on Christian Europeans, who interpreted the Vikings as a punishment from God. Little did they know that this was just the beginning. So, who were these men? What were their goals? And how did they manage to change the world? Let's first get to know the Viking society and the mythologies that shaped them. Above all, there was a great void, and in this void, the realm of cold and heat converged. Through the clash of ice and flames, a giant named Ymir emerged. Ymir, a god possessing both male and female organs, was a creative force. Constantly nourishing himself with the milk of a cosmic cow he created. This cow, while licking salty ice to produce milk, gave rise to another god named Buri. From the lineage of Buri came three gods: Odin and his brothers Vili and Ve. Ymir's blood became oceans, his hair turned into forests, his brain became clouds, and his skeleton transformed into the sky. These three brothers then began to shape the world. In Norse mythology, some significant gods have made their way into the names of days of the week. For example, Woden's Day, Wednesday, is Odin's Day. Thor's Day is Thor's Day. And Friday is Freya's Day. In the Viking society, which was divided into various classes, the upper echelon consisted of nobles known as jarls, while the middle class comprised the freemen, who essentially formed the backbone of Viking society. The boundaries were not rigid, and when a decision needed to be made, jarls and freemen would gather to reach a consensus. Freemen could not be forced into battle. They had to be diplomatically convinced by the jarls, often through promises of abundant alcohol, parties, and loot. Vikings were known for their capacity for alcohol consumption. They drank so much that they were unruly individuals who considered drinking until collapse as a sign of manhood, engaging in drunken duels until the point of defeat. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab merchant and diplomat, witnessed this lifestyle of the Vikings. In his writings, he states, "I have never seen a more perfect physical specimen. They are like palm trees, white-bodied, big men, blonde and reddish, but at the same time, the vilest creatures that God ever created. They drink from morning till night, everyone carries an axe, and they openly commit adultery. They are like wild asses." Being a sincere Muslim, Ibn Fadlan must have been horrified by the scene he encountered. Vikings' passion for entertainment was so profound that it even influenced their concept of heaven. According to their beliefs, brave warriors who died in battle would be guests at the table of the god Odin in the afterlife, spending their days with friends in festivities filled with alcohol, duels, and songs. However, this reward applied only to courageous heroes who died in wars. Those who peacefully passed away in their beds would go to the dark, cold realm known as Hell, considered a type of hell. Vikings derived their desire for war from this fundamental belief in their religion. Another significant segment of society was the slave class, almost equated with animals, constituting the slaves owned by every Viking. Slaves, who made up a quarter of the Viking population, lived under harsh conditions alongside animals and were made to work every day of the year. The continuation of Viking life depended on the cultivation of their gardens, whether owned or leased, and obtaining sufficient yield from livestock such as pigs, sheep, and cows. Slaves were responsible for all these tasks. Therefore, the slave trade held great importance for the Vikings. Small and large Viking groups freely navigated rivers on ships, raiding villages and cities to obtain loot and kidnapping people for the purpose of trade. Women freely roaming in the fields and children mistaking them for ordinary traders were the simplest prey. Slaves were taken from these raids. Slave trade, one of the fundamental sources of income for the Vikings, was carried out by Viking groups freely navigating rivers with their ships. During seasons when Vikings pursued plunder and wealth, the management and organization of slaves in their homes were the responsibility of women. While men collected the spoils of war, women were the sole individuals managing this system. Homes were generally makeshift structures with thatched roofs or sunken into the ground, featuring a single door. Due to the climate, they were usually single-roomed and warmed by a central fire. However, it is important to make a distinction regarding Viking women. Compared to the rest of Europe, Viking women had broader rights. For example, there is evidence of female warriors participating in raids alongside men. A Viking woman had the right to divorce her husband, and if she remained unmarried by the age of 20, she could choose her own place of residence, being recognized as a fully entitled individual under the law. Pagan priests were often composed of women. Traveling on ships called drakar, or dragon, was not easy. The ships, reaching speeds of up to 20 knots, were the fastest of their time. However, they were also the most challenging. Progressing openly and unprotected in storms, snowy and freezing weather was both difficult and opened the door to diseases. Just like in the world of that era, they had to use the sea as their toilet. They also didn't have compasses. However, using a crystal-like stone called the Icelandic spar that could determine the direction of the sun even in cloudy weather by double-breaking the light, they could navigate without knowledge of the existence of the Eastern Roman Empire. This was one of the most remarkable discoveries of the time. In the year 860, a Viking army of 200 ships arrived from the north. Unaware of the existence of the Eastern Roman Empire, to enter Constantinople. Introducing themselves in the most brutal way, they burned and destroyed the city, nailed local Romans to the ships, hacked them with axes, and drowned thousands of people alive. Vikings had a tradition of hanging the heads of their enemies on their ships, and this fear-inducing method was quite effective. The Byzantine army, which was at war with the Arabs at the same time, had no choice but to watch the Viking raids. After weeks of plunder, they left behind only blood and pain as they returned north with their loot-filled ships. For these invaders whose identity was unknown, they were referred to as Raj, meaning Rus, or coming from the north. And this is the origin of the name of present-day Russia. However, contrary to this terrifying encounter between Vikings and Byzantium, a good relationship developed over time. Through agreements, Vikings were allowed to use the bathhouses and could procure as much bread, wine, meat, fish, etc. as they desired in the city. However, the Byzantine emperor, having learned his lesson as a traitor, prohibited them from entering the city with weapons, according to the agreement. The martial prowess of the Vikings was so impressive that the emperor even established a special guard unit composed of Vikings for himself. Today, we still see the traces of these men in Hagia Sophia, probably bored during a ceremony they attended in Hagia Sophia. A Viking engraved his name on a stone, which is now exhibited on the upper floor of Hagia Sophia. The section containing the stone with the inscription Halfon has been closed to the public for several years due to ongoing restoration work. While some were engaged in trade in Constantinople, some Vikings were preparing to venture further west. The discovery of Iceland is detailed in their sagas, with the famous Viking explorer Floki setting sail from Norway with his family to explore previously mentioned lands. Although he wasn't the first to discover Iceland, Floki rediscovered it and became the first to establish a settlement. The story of this event is interesting. During the 868 journey, Floki took 3 ravens with him. In the open seas, he released the ravens. The first raven headed towards a previously known island, the second returned to the ship, and the third did not return. Following the direction of the third raven, Floki and his crew reached Iceland, where the first thing they encountered was icy terrain, leading them to name the island Iceland. In subsequent years, Eric, one of the Vikings in Iceland, would become the first Viking to establish a settlement in Greenland, and his descendants would go even further west, becoming the first Europeans to reach America. 500 years before Columbus, this first settlement on the coast of Newfoundland in Canada can still be visited today. However, surprisingly, this village with fertile land was abruptly abandoned and left as it is. The exact reason why the Vikings left is unknown. Many believe they abandoned the village due to attacks from the indigenous people, or continued their journey towards America. However, there is no definitive evidence. In the same century, Europe was in turmoil. Viking leaders were emerging from the ranks, becoming powerful and wealthy. This development led to the establishment of regular Viking armies, reaching 45,000 soldiers, replacing the small groups that previously fought for adventure. France, England, Spain, and Eastern Europe were literal battlegrounds. The rivers running through Europe facilitated Viking ship transportation, allowing them to launch sudden attacks anywhere at any time. In 845, Paris would fall victim to Viking raids, deeply influencing Turkish history as well. The Viking army, numbering between 4,000 to 5,000 and thought to be led by the legendary Viking king Ragnar, also known as Reginharus, marched their ships overland with wooden sledges to overcome the chains drawn across the Seine River. The advancing army reached Paris in April, attacked and seized the city, and after receiving a substantial amount of ransom, they ended the plunder and left the city. However, this technique they employed was not the first or the last. They used this method in the raids on Istanbul and various loots in Europe. They considered the portability of their ships when constructing them. Whether it was the books that inspired Mehmed the Conqueror, known for his love of reading and mastery of languages like Latin and Greek, or the same technique used 115 years earlier by Umar Bey, is unknown. Umar Bey, among the first Turkish sailors, used this technique to carry his ships 10 kilometers overland to cross the Gulf of Inabata in 1338. Was the Ragnar character we watched in the Vikings series real? According to historians, Ragnar Lodbrok is not a single person, but a mythicized combination of various leaders who lived in the 800s and brought golden days to the Vikings. The most emphasized name is Reginharus, who invaded Paris in 845 as mentioned in the video. However, we know that figures like Bjorn, Ivar, Ube, and Sigurd, who are mentioned as Ragnar's children in the legends, are real historical figures. Still, there is no historical data indicating that they are Ragnar's children. In fact, in Anglo-Saxon and Frank sources from the 800s, there is not a single sentence about who their father is or whether they are brothers. Going even further, we first see the words Ragnar Lodbrok combined as a single name in the writings of an Icelandic author in 1120. Thus, the character Ragnar Lodbrok, emerging nearly 3 centuries after the period in which these individuals supposedly lived, is actually a mythical figure composed of the combination of famous Viking kings with little-known rights. How did the Viking era come to an end? In 1066, the invasion of England by Viking descendant commander Harold Hardrada and the victory of Viking descendant King William marked the end of an era for the Vikings. However, everything was not entirely over. Norman Vikings, starting in 999, established a significant kingdom in Italy and gained the Pope's approval. During this period, significant changes such as the construction of large castles and the strengthening of feudalism in Europe began to take place. Additionally, Christianity started to become a widespread religion in Viking societies, making the Vikings part of Europe. In 1066, Viking descendant King William, who completely invaded and established a kingdom in England, reshaped Europe. However, with the Christianization and assimilation of the Vikings, the old kings began to see themselves as English, French, Spanish, Italian, etc. Instead of Odin's feasts and excitement, they now looked forward to the heavenly realm of Jesus. In the end, a handful of Vikings returned to Scandinavia and started a new life. Being able to continue the stories and beliefs of the past meant the end of a great adventure. It was not the enemies who defeated the Vikings, but the transformation within the reconstructed Europe they created. The audience was thanked for being a part of this adventure, leaving behind memorable individuals and stories. And reminded to subscribe to the channel and leave comments. Until we meet again.